So, welcome to another random interview by myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, A Tippling Philosopher. I write for the Patheos Nonreligious network. As I have said in the last few videos, I have catheters in my neck. I'm receiving stem cells treatment and chemotherapy for progressive primary multiple sclerosis in a clinic in Russia, where I'm in isolation. And to save me just speaking to the walls or to myself or opening the fridge and demanding things that aren't there, I thought it would be a much nicer idea to speak to real humans, even though they might not be in the same room. So today, I would like to introduce you to another Jonathan and let him tell you a little bit about himself before we have a chat about stuff. So, Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Jonathan Burrello. I'm a cartoonist, a comedian, a traveler, and I've kind of lived all over the place. I'm American. I've lived on both coasts and in the Midwest. I've also lived in Korea. I've lived in Spain. And through it all, I've been and also Canada, I should say. That's where I am now. And through it all, I've been doing cartoons and stand-up as much as I can. And I like comedy, I guess.
Well, that's a really interesting remit to talk about, because actually we can compare and contrast the different places that you've lived in as far as comedy, worldviews, appreciation of freedom of speech. There's an awful lot of really great stuff that we can get our teeth into. So, first of all, what got you into, I suppose, comedy and artwork?
Well, I guess so the artwork was first. That was the first thing I really remember doing as a kid. Was they gave me a pencil and I couldn't hold it until I was maybe 5, and then once I was able to hold it correctly, I kind of just took off and was just creating things and making things. Several members of my family are very musically gifted, and some are visually artistic as well. And so I think I got lucky with that. And just if you have that to begin with and you keep doing it, it just becomes a kind of just natural.
So what was a journey then? I mean, obviously, when you're a young artist, you're interested probably in things that are quite frivolous or entertaining, or I don't know. But
well, that doesn't go away.
Yeah. So what helped to shape your journey to send you on the journey to where you are now, do you think?
A series of poor decisions, like it always is. I don't know. As a kid, I read a lot of like Far Side cartoons and Bloom County and Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts, and I would try to like copy them, like panel for panel on pieces of paper. Just any paper I could find in the house, I'd just be like drawing on it, trying to make. I can't get a pen out of my hand now.
So is that from an artistic point of view, or because some of those are quite deeply cynical? Cartoon, as in what they're trying to say, and the content of the comedy there is quite cynical. Was it a bit of both then?
It was a bit of both. When I was really young, I don't think I understood most of what was going on, and particularly like Bloom County was a little bit more political and more cynical than some of the other ones. And I don't think I understood it, but I liked the style of illustration really caught my eye. Yeah. And so I would copy jokes I didn't even understand. I would just draw them again and draw them again because I was trying to figure them out. No, it wasn't like I was trying to take credit for them. I wanted to figure them out. I wanted to know, how does this work? Why do these lines come together this way?
So do you think there's, you probably heard of a comedian called Jimmy Carr, who's a very, very, very famous comedian, particularly for his one-liners, but he's done a lot of work into the kind of psychology and the mechanics of comedy. Do you look very much at at how it works and how to craft a joke that works for your purposes, or does it just kind of come intuitively?
I think a lot of it is throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks. So I don't always like the cartoons that I make when they're done, but I like the process of putting them together and trying to figure them out a little bit. And I probably spend too much time on them because I'm into like the directing of it. Like I like to, there's no camera, but I like to switch positions and like kind of try different angles and be a little bit more cinematic, because that's what I like to see in a cartoon.
There's an interesting
plus the joke.
There's an interesting rabbit hole there, because some research on well-being suggests that we like to set ourselves goals, consistently set ourselves goals, but we don't really achieve the happiness and well-being by achieving those goals. It's the journey towards that, and it's the journey that and especially with artwork where you're building things up and you see this picture coming together, or this piece of comedy artwork coming together, and then the end result is almost anticlimactic, because right, you're done, now what do I do with that? So now it's on to the next piece. So it's the journey that really pushes us onwards.
I think of it the same way I think of stand-up, where you're chasing that high of just being in the moment on stage, doing it, and then when it's over, you're like, okay, I need to find another stage. I need to do that again, do it better this next time, or I want to try this new thing. And then the same thing with cartoons, it's the same. I like the process of putting it together, and then once it's out, and I'm like, all right, I'm done. Next thing.
It appears to be just like taking crack, then.
Yes.
Not that I know, but
I think Jerry Seinfeld had a remark about that. Someone asked him what his favorite episode of Seinfeld was, and he says, "That's a ridiculous question. That would be like asking what's your favorite breath of air," and you would say, "Well, whatever breath gets me to the next one."
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect encapsulation of what creating this kind of stuff is.
So okay, so you become, I assume, an established artist in some way. What then led to you becoming part of the Patheos Nonreligious network, or what led you into, probably first of all, into questioning ideas, if you ever had ideas of religion?
Like I grew up in a very Christian, and I was Christian for most of my life. And it wasn't until I got into my 20s because I went to religious colleges and universities. It wasn't until that, I don't know if I should say.
Like Liberty. That's the only one I know. John.
Overall, I should say I had pretty good experiences at those colleges. I had things that made me question things, that made me question things a lot harder than I guess I had before.
Good.
And I think that was ultimately good. And then so I'd been doing cartoons this whole time in like little small local capacities wherever I could do it. So school newspapers was where I was doing it. And then once I got out of that world, and I was going through a bit of like a paradigm shift of like, oh my gosh, none of this makes sense to me anymore. And I have moral issues with it, and thinking about it a lot more critically. I threw away all my characters and started from scratch with a brand new cast, and tried to make it a little bit more about, I don't know, I feel like my comic series now is Blinky and Sal has a bit of an identity crisis. It doesn't know what it wants to be.
Right.
But it's me processing myself and trying to figure out, okay, what is it I think, and what are the values I hold now? What are the things that I have issues with?
And to be fair,
I've been
that's
doing that for a couple of
important.
years, and I noticed, I think Hemant Mehta and a few others on Patheos. And since I had several cartoons that dealt with the concept of God, not a lot of them, but a couple, and I'm like, all right, there is a worldview to this, and I have a worldview. I come from this perspective of having left this religious mindset. Maybe this would be a good fit. I don't know if it was.
So I
pitched
think
the comic to them, and they said, yeah.
I think setting an overarching mission statement or a vision I know it sounds very corporate and cliche, but actually it does give you that direction. I think it's easy to meander around in any walk of life, you know, as with creating characters. Um, if you don't have this overarching narrative or endpoint that you're, or thing that you're trying to disseminate very clearly, then it can become sort of aimless. So I suppose that is a really important thing.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what, because a lot of research suggests that I'm a philosopher, right? So I spend all my time trying to convince people not to believe in God for all these highfalutin reasons that basically have bugger all effect on them. Because the things that really change people's lives are stuff to do with the moral zeitgeist in their life. You know, I've got gay friends, they're really nice. I've been told by my pastor that they will go to hell. Yeah. I can't sort of reconcile that. Something's going on here. Or it's more to do with that. What was it that brought you to your sort of moment of questioning?
Well, it wasn't like a singular event, and this is something, and I even wrote this in the book that you had out. Is that I would much prefer it this way. That I would rather have a slow and deliberate intellectual process that I could admit possibly to be an error. I would prefer that over an emotional event that I would consider to be unimpeachably true, and I have to believe this because I felt this way at a moment, because I don't trust emotions to be the most reliable thing for assessing reality. I think they're important and they're helpful, but a lot of conversion and deconversion stories and conversion to other faith stories, they always have this emotional moment, and I don't trust those because, as I've said, they've resulted in conversions to every single religion and non-religion you can imagine.
Well, what you get is the emotion. You get the emotional conversion, and then you get the post hoc rationalization that follows along afterwards that says, and this is why it makes sense.
Yeah, and I am very skeptical of those things because I notice we all do them, and they don't lead to the same conclusions. So therefore, I have a hard time using that as the defining thing. For me, it was just, gradual punches and chips away at the blocks that were the pillars of my faith. Things about like with science positions or anti-science positions or issues with LGBTQ, and then some political things overlapping. And it was when I got into like the broader world, like going to school in Kansas and then California, and kind of being like, okay, there's a lot more to this.
I think there's a lot to that, actually. I think there's a lot. I don't really know because I've never been particularly religious. As a child, I was nominally so. But I imagine if you're a Bible Belt America or some kind of community of strong Christian or whatever religion, and you are moving about and you are seeing all these other cultures and all these other people and understanding that they're just normal people going about their normal lives, I'd imagine that is one of the most powerful attritional manners with which you can shed a very strong belief.
Yeah, I think it wasn't just that I was encountering other cultures in America and then later in Asia, but it was seeing that the religion that I grew up in, I was aware that it looked a little bit different across the time periods. Like if you go back in history, it's a little different, and you go further back, it's even more different. But just observing that the faith that I grew up in looked different across the country, in different states, in different churches, even around the block. And then you go to another country and they're worshiping the same religion that you're worshiping, but their view of it is even different. And then you're like, okay, so this does seem to be like a very human concoction that we're all operating under. And then you kind of get to the point where you're like, God seems to have as many faces as he does people that believe in him.
Yeah.
And maybe we're not worshiping the same thing. We're worshiping kind of the ideals that we want, with like the things that we believe to be important about ourselves, about humanity, coupled with myths that we were told culturally growing up. And that made more sense to me.
Of course, and I think
Not seem unified.
that really feeds into the fact that there are 42,000 different denominations of Christianity, or there's a God for every single believer, and God seems to be an anthropomorphization or anthropocentrism. You know, we see God as just a really bloody good version of ourselves. And so therefore, when we go and berate someone, we do it, you know, on behalf of God, you know, if we're a believer, because God is just a super version of us. I see that quite a lot.
Yeah. And I think like it was more complicated. It was that plus a few other things. And then when I was younger, I would have looked at who is the guy who converted looking at a waterfall? Who is a famous atheist guy who converted. He saw a waterfall and thought of the Trinity, and he became religious after that. I had an opposite. I forget the name of the guy. He was a scientist. I had a reverse experience of that. When I was younger, I would have looked at like nature, mountains and valleys, and thought, wow, God is quite a painter. Just like, look how beautiful and wonderful this is. And I remember I was driving across the country from California to New York by myself with all the stuff I owned in my car, just driving because I was going to make the move, say goodbye to my family and move to Korea. And I remember seeing Monument Valley and these amazing structures, and everything's incredible and wonderful. And I looked at all of that and I thought, how would any of this be different if there were no God? Like, I understand a little bit about geology, and I understand kind of how rocks, you know, come to these shapes, and they do seem quite arbitrary. I mean, yes, they're beautiful, but that's a subjective, you know, value to put on it. And it's a weird thing to look at something in nature and say, wow, that's beautiful. That must be a magical being that's much better. Because then what happens if you look at horrors in nature? Stephen Fry talks about this with, you know, larvas.
Richard Attenborough with worms that burrow into small children's eyes to make them blind. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, it does seem to me like we're on a planet that is, it's the puddle looking around itself like, wow, this puddle is perfectly formed for me. And you're like, no, this is how it worked out. Like a little bit of, you know, different environments, different.
I think that's a deceptively powerful argument, because I think that you can just as easily look around this world and imagine it's a world without a God. I mean, what I do all the time, I'm amazed to think that a God could create this and do all this in exactly the same way that a Christian looks around and says, wow, it has to be God. I mean, to me, they're you know, two sides of the same coin. I mean, Stephen Law talks about the evil God thesis when he talks about there's just enough, you know, evil in the world to make it look like God is trying to be evil, in the same way that Christians would say there's just enough good in the world to make it look like there's a good God. So, but yes, I think that's powerful.
And I would say, even those values aside, just how, why? Okay, if you're a person and before you understand anything about subatomic life or, you know, heavenly bodies like in outer space and how they move and how the gravitational forces work on planets to shape them and make them, it's so detailed, and most of it we never get to see, or for most of our history we weren't even aware of it. And these, you know, cosmic battles on a microscopic and a huge scale have been going on all around us forever without us knowing about it. And we're still in the middle of it going like, yep, it's all for us.
Yeah, and
it's weird.
That's a really interesting
there's
point.
There's a strange risk to that.
Because there's a really interesting point, because lots of Christians think that we are the zenith of creation. And yet really, if you look at the whole universe, it appears to be more finely tuned for black holes, which are far more destructive and and dangerous to our very existence. So it just depends at what scale you look at the universe. We love looking at a scale that's just us, but of course that's problematic.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of blindness to that kind of thing. We don't think about it, and I think that's. I mean, I like science. I like learning about it because it's, you know, the world that we live in, and like, just because you don't have a magical deity to account for it doesn't mean you can't look at things in awe and be like, oh my gosh, this is the most incredible thing. Like, isn't this amazing that we're here and the way we are?
Yeah, absolutely. So what can you tell me about your experiences of faith or lack of faith in the different places that you've lived? Say, for example, Canada or Korea, or even different areas of the United States.
I grew up Pentecostal, which is weird for a little Italian boy because we're emotional enough, you know. We don't need this too, like everything. But I grew up, I was taught to speak in tongues and get slain in the Holy Spirit. You know, you fall back and you do the whole thing. I've done all that.
Okay. Before we go on.
Yeah.
What was going through your head? Did you genuinely believe something? Do you think that you had some kind of psychological experience that you misinterpreted, or was there an element of self-delusion?
I'm sure it's different for a lot of people. I can only speak to my own experience. But I said, I grew up, everyone spoke in tongues, always in church. I thought this was normal. I didn't do it. I didn't know how. And then I was in a camp for Pentecostal kids, and it was a very like charismatic worship service that they would do 2 or 3 times a day. And you're in a big, you know, chapel with maybe 1,000 kids, and suddenly there's a wave of people just start like laughing, or people just start crying. And I remember the first couple weeks, I was like, I don't understand how come I don't feel anything? What's going on? And I don't know, maybe I never truly was Christian, as they tell me. But I wanted to be part of that, and I would go to the altar. I asked Christ to come into my heart at least 90 times in my lifetime as a child, and every time I would maybe imagine, I felt like an octopus swimming inside of me, or it didn't feel like anything, or I would try to think about something that made me feel guilty, and I would cry, and I would try to like bring some kind of emotional experience. And I remember the first time I spoke in tongues, it was because the counselor told me, just repeat this, Ashandalaba. And I'm like, really? He says, yeah, if you repeat that enough, eventually it will come naturally and you'll just be able to do it. So I began to do that, and I did that by myself in my room at home. I would do it in church after that. And then same thing with being slain in the Holy Spirit. I kept going up. They would do the hands. I would have the guys would be like, I'm ready, God, give it to me. And then nothing would happen. And I was bewildered. I'm like, what's going on? So finally I said, you know what? I'm going to fall back. I'm going to make something out of this. I want this experience. I'm offering myself. I'm open. I want to be here, and I want to experience God in this way. And I faked it. I fell back. And as I was lying on the floor, I remember just thinking, I don't know how much of this is, everyone is just faking it like this, but while I'm here, I'm at least going to pray. So I'm going to find some use out of this. And it was very much manufactured, I think, for me anyway.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. So, so moving off to, I don't know where you went next, parts of America or Korea or Canada. Canada is where you are now. What experiences can you elucidate on?
Tongues sounds different in different regions. So if it is an angelic language, much like the faces of God, there's no unifying qualities to it. It's tonal gibberish that is related to the language spoken in that area or the accent in that area. And that to me is very interesting.
What in what sense? Are we talking glossolalia still, or are we
Yeah,
talking about
glossolalia, tongues. Yeah, glossolalia. Growing up in upstate New York, it does not sound like it does in California or in the
really?
South. It does not sound anything like because in Korea, I went to a Pentecostal church for a very short time, and they also spoke in tongues. Doesn't sound like the tongues I grew up in. So I mean, there's a lot going on here where you can see how, mass groups of people coming together doing a repeated activity does mean something to people, and there is an emotional connection people have to that. And I think, like, yeah, it's very easy to be swept away in the emotions of like the music and the lighting, and you're told this means something and you have to feel this, and it's very calculated in this way.
Well, it's a psychological function. I see religion as a whole. I consulted on a book by James A. Lindsay called Everyone's Wrong About God, which is to say that God exists but doesn't. We're in a post-God world. But God provides, or has provided, so many functional benefits or functional aspects to humanity that if we're going to shed God, we need to replace those with secular psychological functions, if you like. So for those people in those different places getting those things out of those rituals, they are getting something is happening to them psychologically, which is of benefit to them. Otherwise they wouldn't do it. So therefore, if you were to say that's nonsense, stop doing that, then something you would expect need to replace that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, this is kind of like the Nietzsche thing that, God is dead and we've killed him. But are we mature enough to go the next step after that? Like, you've had this structure. This is the biggest thing I miss about religion. Like, apart from the community aspect, religions, any religion, gives you a blueprint for what your life should look like, more or less. When to get married, how to treat your fellow man. And these are all positive things in many cases, not always, but that there is a
structure.
This is very, I think, healthy mentally for people. Like, this is the animal we are.
If you like prescriptive living, right?
Sure, it's not for everybody, but I think for a lot of people that structure is beneficial. And I see the attractiveness of it, and that's one of the things that I miss, because, you unplug from that world in your 20s and you're like, I don't know what to do with myself right now. Like, you have to kind of build a new life schedule, and the rules aren't as clear cut, and you're kind of in a sea all alone, and it's very it's different.
And I think that's where things like the Sunday Assembly and these new organizations that have come along to replace churches, I actually do think have a viable place in society, because I think we are social creatures that do need social networks, and churches and religions provide social networks so successfully that in fact they're almost impossible to extricate from. So in order to get yourself out of that, you often need to fall into a very supportive network of secular or atheistic or humanistic people and networks, and so I agree with you there. I think there is definitely a place for, I think it was Alain de Botton that talked about atheism 2.0, which is, let's nick the good things of religion, the music, the architecture, or whatever it may be, and let's use them atheistically for the benefit of those communities.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're any kind of humanist, you have to recognize that most religions, if you're any humanist at all, you have to acknowledge every religion is built by humans, and there is humanism within them to varying degrees.
Of course.
And basically, the conclusion I came to is it's not important. I could never prove that there is no God or there is no God intellectually with any type of thing like that. So to me, it's not as important what someone thinks in their head about the nature of reality, like about some metaphysical realm that's unprovable. That doesn't matter to me. What matters is how you treat people now and the consequences of your actions.
Yeah. So it's being a good moral humanist, and by humanist, actually, as you say, that can be a religious humanist, right?
It could be.
Know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I lost my train of thought.
So, I mean, then it becomes about negotiating those very tough minefields of morality, because at the end of the day, morality is arrived by consensus. Essentially, it's an abstract ideal that exists in our heads, and when we agree on it, we kind of write moral dictionaries, or we write it in a dictionary, or we encode it into law. So I just did a video on whether that human rights don't exist, right? Human rights don't exist outside of our heads. They exist in our heads. And then when we agree on those human rights, and we say, actually, that's a really good right. Yeah, that's a really good right. Okay, I can see that as being universal. Then we codify that into a law, and that law gives ramifications and meaning and pragmatism to the human rights. And so the idea is to have universal laws that apply to everyone, but agreeing those things are really difficult, because at the end of the day, take the abortion, pro-life, pro-choice debates, where you've got people arguing to toss over two completely different positions. And you have to try and negotiate through that. So being a moral humanist is a tough gig.
Yeah, and I think it would be very silly to imagine whatever position you come from, or angle or culture you find yourself in, it would be very silly to assume that we've put all of these moral quandaries to bed. We still talk about them. You still see the war movies where the guy is injured and like, oh, he's not going to make it. Do we still take him with us, or do we kill him, or what do we like? These are things that can still happen, and we still have to deal with them individually as they come up. Even if it's written in a book and you believe this book is true, when you're in that situation, it's not that easy.
Well, because all these things really depend. So when it comes to moral philosophizing, it comes down to the axioms you start with. So what happens is we often argue about these things up here. Is it okay to torture someone? Well, did it work? Blah, 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 blah. Well, let's take that down a bunch of steps. Is it okay to use someone else for your own ends? Are we talking about utilitarianism? Are we talking about consequentialism? Are we talking about, Kantian categorical imperatives or whatever? You need to sort out these base axioms of morality before you start piddling about talking about the stuff up here. But we spend time watching films and debating about these things without really grounding where they're coming from. So that's why we end up having arguments. If we could agree on the axioms at the beginning, then everything else would naturally follow. But agreeing on the axioms is a bit more difficult than it appears to be.
Yeah, and I think more than axioms, just having the humility to maybe not have so rigid a system. I think like agreeing on basics, like, okay, we want fairness. We want, okay, well, what is fairness and how does that look? That's the problem. Like you, as soon as you make it into a statement, then it can be interpreted any way.
Yeah, fair for who? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a very complicated thing. I wouldn't be advocating that like, no one ever be religious. My only fear is religious type thinking can lead to increasingly more problematic things. And you can see, and religious thinking could exist anywhere. It just means that I'm right. I come from the right position.
It's dogmatism, really. Dogmatism is the problem, and that exists in every sphere of political, religious, and non-religious thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, just having we live in a world where there's always going to be a difference of opinion. So rather than trying to figure out, well, how do we get rid of this other opinion? Like, well, no, how do we live well with each other, and how do we find the common ground? But what is it we both want? We probably want a lot of the same things, and perhaps we can get those things, and I'd be much more comfortable.
So what's your opinion of
Yeah.
how things are different in Canada with regard to religion, to different moral dimensions, to dogmatism? I know Trudeau there has been trying really hard to appease everyone. Some people say too much. You know, I'd be interested to see what your opinions of your life there are at the moment.
Yeah, most of my experience is limited to Montreal, which is a little bit different than, you know, the rest of Canada. Quebec is its own thing; it has its own identity. It has a rich history of Catholicism, and there's a lot of old buildings. My favorite thing about the French language here is all the cursing is religious related. Really? So the most offensive thing you could say is tabernacle, which means tabernacle. And you're like, how is that offensive? Like, well, the way it's used, you can't say it.
Tabernacle.
Yeah, but I like that. That's kind of a fun little cultural tidbit.
Yeah.
Montreal's an interesting place because it's extremely. It's at least in the circles I seem to find myself in, and doing comics and stand up, and more of like the artistic side. It's a very bohemian place.
Yeah.
So it's a very different mindset. Things are very, very open and loose. Everyone's pansexual, polyamorous. It's a completely different world. So there's that navigating to do. Yeah, I guess it's sort of the extreme opposite of, I guess, where I came from.
Yeah. And it's quite different from mainland, I don't know how you call it, mainland Canada as well. So there's a deep sense of independence in Quebec, where I suppose you're having a very different experience than you might have, say, in Toronto or Ottawa or somewhere else.
Yeah, and I'd say the thing that you learn from traveling is nationalism is gross in every country.
Yeah.
Like there, every place you go, there's people who don't want you there because you're not from there.
Well, in-group, out-group psychology is just so pervasive, and you know, everyone's a little bit racist, right? Because we have these things, evolutionary nuggets of heritage that are left over that give us distrust of people who aren't like us. Now, hundreds of thousands of years ago, that was very useful. But nowadays, it's not so useful for living in social cohesion and harmony. But so we have to fight hard not to be xenophobic. We have to overcome our racism, and that is us being rational over our intuitive selves, and that can be difficult for some people.
Yeah, I know one of the issues that keeps coming up in Quebec in particular is like the hijab ban.
Yeah.
For head coverings. And I realize that's a whole can of worms with a lot of different opinions on it, but I come at it from the same perspective that I came at before, where it's like, all right, we have multiple opinions on this. Should we police certain people's opinions? And I don't think we should. I'm like, look, you don't have to believe in their religion, but if they really feel like they have to wear that, let them wear it. Passing a law to stop it is just bullying to me. And it's sort of like, I would not think we should pass a law to, like, say you can't wear a little cross necklace. Like, what? That would be psychotic to me. I don't understand why anyone would care. Like,
out of interest, I do draw a line. So I draw a line on a full face veil, but I do it for these reasons.
Sure.
Not in general, but if you're going to have a transaction with me, if I was to walk into a shop and I had a motorbike helmet on, I would be made to take it off, because you cannot read my facial expressions, and supposedly somewhere up to 80% of our communication is done facially. So if we're having a transaction, I have the upper hand here, and I am manipulating you to get what. There's more chance of me getting what I want than you getting what you want. So if I was having a parents' evening and someone sat down with me with a full face veil on, and I couldn't read a single bit of their body language, I would feel aggrieved, and I would feel that was, and it's not a religious thing actually, Although I think
Sure. There's an argument.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
religious oppression going on there, which I do
Sure.
disagree with as well. And
Same.
I think that it is underwritten by male wishes, even though it's quite similar to the pornography debate in the fact that the women say, right, I'm entitled to empower myself to be a porn actress because that's what I want to do. But at the end of the day, I'm doing it to appease predominantly the male audience, and therefore there's a kind of manipulation going on there or an exploitation going on there. And I think yes, it is the right of the woman to do that, but then it's it's picking that apart a little bit. And I think it's the same with the full face veil, but for me it's a transactional thing.
Sure.
that involves simple communication at its initial point. But I'm totally with you on the hijab. I really couldn't give a monkey.
It's not something. Well, this is the thing that as an American, I've become increasingly cynical politically, because and it seems very similar, a bit different in Canada, but it has the same problems where you have in both places. I think you have more conservative parties which seem to be actively trying to hurt different communities and groups, and then liberal parties which are lip service only, like they don't do as much, or they say they will, but it's just to be the counterpoint, and I don't see as much action done on the part. So that's something that sort of, I don't know, depresses me about the political state.
I think there's an interesting idea about liberalism with teeth. I remember my friend talking some time ago about that if you have pure liberalism, it's very easy to be taken advantage of because you're like the nicey guy. But if you can't stand up for those liberal rights in some kind of robust manner, then you will be taken advantage of. So it's how do you get liberalism with teeth? So how do you say, right, we're really going to stand up for the rights of these oppressed people, but we're going to do it in a way that you're not going to mess with, that's really robust. And I think that's a difficult course to navigate.
Yeah, I think I don't know who said this first, but I heard it from like Matt Dillahunty talking about how you design a society, the blank slate thing, or I forget what it's called. There's a word for it, but it's basically you would design a society not knowing who you would be in that society. So will you be a man, a woman?
This
gay,
is
straight,
Rawls. Is this The Veil of Ignorance by John Rawls?
Yes, that's what it is. Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that's not talked about more in schools or in philosophy classes. I think that's an important way.
It's brilliant. If you don't know who you're going to be, how would you set up the rules? So you are going to be a random member of society born anywhere in the world. Therefore, you should really set the rules up as fairly as possible, because you could be on the wrong side of that. And the Veil of Ignorance, I think, is a fantastic thought experiment, and it has ramifications that stretch out into jurisprudence and all sorts of different things. But yeah.
You'd wipe out libertarianism if people learned about this.
Oh, don't get me started on libertarianism.
Oh gosh, it's like, what? I could be born with like a disability? Changes everything. I don't know. It's
no, definitely, that's a game changer. Yeah, and I think that does make you think about all sorts of things. I quite often talk about inheritance tax. Now, inheritance tax is a thing in Britain that causes a lot of consternation. So you get a lot of people that earn sometimes through merit, sometimes not, like Trump earned $140 million for being born. But well done. Well done. But for people who work their life away and they do amazing things and they make loads of money, you have an intuitive sense that I want to keep this money for my family in a kind of almost an evolutionary sense. I want to pass this on to my children to advantage them, so that really it's those genes propagate and do really, really well.
Yeah.
But the problem is those children have done absolutely nothing to merit receiving that money. You've got as much right to go up to a random child on the street and give them that money. They just happen to have been born from you. Unless you're going to talk about eugenics here, really, neither of these two children have done anything to merit that money, let's say. And so therefore inheritance is a real problematic thing for me. Although if I was rich and was going to die, I would intuitively want to give it to my kids. I understand.
Right. You get that. It's natural.
But rationally, I think the government should redistribute that income so that it equalizes the opportunity of people who are far less fortunate than myself, so that they could achieve the same things as me, or I give it away before I die. But you know what I mean? So that kind of veil of ignorance, you know, we go through life with the different cards that we're dealt with that we have very little control over, and you would hope that society is set up in a way that would somehow equalize opportunity for us all. I mean, the only problem is if you take that to the nth degree, it looks like a very homogenous society. So there are issues with doing that completely, but I hope you get what I'm saying there.
Yeah, and I think this is the one point that I do tend to agree with people who are very much against, like, you know, taxation and redistribution of wealth into like infrastructure or schools or things like this, is the people who don't trust the government to not be corrupt with that money. And I am sympathetic to that. I'm like, I get that's a natural fear to have.
Dude, America has lobbying
like
I've never seen.
I don't know what else we have to
lobbying is legal corruption, and I am so angry with lobbying. So I do agree with that. If government is done well and transparently, the way it should be done, then fair play. But as soon as you get vested interests and lobbying, it can really suck.
The American politics is its own nonsense parade of just like you mentioned the lobbies, like that's even just the beginning of it. And then I don't even recognize my country anymore. It's weird having been all over the place. I've been to a lot of different countries over the past couple of years, the past 6 years, and every place I've gone, since they've watched the news, they're like, everyone seems to be more or less unanimous that what's going on in your country seems unusual and very, very wrong. And then I'm like, yeah, I agree with you. And as soon as I get off the plane coming back to my homeland, everyone's like, it's debatable. Like, it's how racist is too racist? What are we qualifying? And I'm like, do you realize that you're the only ones who are not sure about this? This is the same way America is the only one who's still wondering, is climate change a thing? I don't know. Did we do it?
The problem is that you have the narrowest democracy you can. You have a two-party system, which involves first past the post, and the electoral college system, which means that you can lose the vote even though you get the popular vote, and
disenfranchises voters too.
And it polarizes voters, so that you just get single issue voters. You know, I remember seeing one of our politicians went to do a show in America called Trumpland, and he went around these different sort of Trump supporters, just really getting into their minds. And he went to this black radio presenter who would, you normally, and I don't want to be stereotypical here particularly, but everything else about him, you would have thought, well, he would have been a Democratic voter, but he was a guns rights activist like you've never believed. And so therefore he said, I don't care what you do with my country. I don't care what you do, but if you take away my right to have a gun, you're out of here. I am voting Republican on that alone. And so you get so many single issue voters, abortion and guns rights, that mean that the politicians can do what the hell they like to the rest of the country, because as long as they keep these core issues safe for their base voters, then jobs are good.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues is it's a lot of these positions are built around a lie. Like no one, as far as I know of, in democratic circles, are trying to remove guns.
No,
No one.
no.
Uh, so like the whole idea that you can't take my guns, no one's trying to. The whole idea that people just want abortion on demand and use it as birth control, and they want to be able to abort babies after they're born. No one's saying that either. Like so you drum up fear based around lies, and it rallies people, and they become very passionate. Because if you believe that, let's say guns, let's say abortion, let's say anything, is the most important thing, or it's a great evil, you'll overlook a lot if you think that is the most important thing. And that's what happened with the last election, because I know a lot of people who are like very devout, very religious, and like, Trump represents everything you hate. How could you vote for him? He's like, well,
white working class in America bite off their nose to spite their face. It's like, yeah, we're going to vote Trump on evangelical issues, guns rights, or whatever. But then, oh no, I've got no health care. Or, oh no, my taxes have gone up. Or, oh no, or, and you think you have just been completely blinded to things that really affect your life. I mean, really affect your life, because you're worrying about all this kind of shite at the top here. I mean, really, how often do you want to go around shooting people? How often are you going to get healthcare? Well, probably once you've shot your toddler in the foot. I don't know.
Yeah. Like a lot of Americans, I'm bewildered at how many things just are they're partisan.
Yeah.
Like healthcare, I don't understand how this is a partisan issue.
Yeah.
Or just wanting there to be, regulations to make sure we can, like gun control. Like not that we're taking them away, but like if you have to pass a test to have a car, maybe have a similar thing with that. Like and not give them to people who have histories of, violence.
I'm not sure that healthcare is actually starting to cross party lines a little bit more than it was maybe 5 years ago. I get the sense that the polls suggest that actually universal healthcare is becoming a little more popular amongst some of the Republicans. But I'm not too sure. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how some of these new, Ocasio-Cortez and other newbies on the scene are gonna really, shake things up, or whether they just piss off the Republicans and some of their Democrats enough to be marginalized. I don't know, but it's an interesting time. Trump 2020 is going to be. Goodness knows. Who knows?
I mean, I as much as I don't like it, I have a feeling he's going to get reelected. I'm not happy about it, but I don't know. I lost a lot of faith in my fellow Americans over the last couple of years, and I realize for the past few years, we've been in this weird limbo of what is our health care? What is going on? Are we being penalized for not having it? Is it cheaper? Is it better? What happens to the insurance companies? Nobody knows the answer to these.
But they do know. The thing is, they do know the answers to them, but they are just misinformed the answers by the media sources that they choose to.
Sure. But also, it's that it has been going back and forth, and there is this. This is, I think, the most, not the most, but one of the things that I think is very bad about the Trump presidency is his whole campaign was to undo everything his predecessor Obama did. So what does that mean? If the next Democrat gets in office, I'm running on a campaign to undo everything Trump did, and then next Republican. That's insane. You can't do that. Like, that's wasting so much time and money. Like, we don't need a government if that's what the government is.
And the other thing that really, really worries me is the inoculation of the American public to blatant lies. I mean, Trump's lie count is almost 9,000 now, and he can say
normalized.
He's normalized just talking absolute shite. He can say absolutely anything, and no one appears to care. You'll get the Washington Post saying, well, this is another lie. You get the liberal media going, this is just lies. But then his base supporters couldn't give a monkey's. And you're thinking, you know, we're in this kind of post-truth society at the moment, which is really, really worrying, and it's creeping over into the UK. We've got Brexit, we've got our own issues, where people appear to be able to say what the hell they like and get away with it, and there are no ramifications, and there's no call for resignation. So someone can do something completely ridiculous and say something completely ridiculous, and you go, oh God, what a crazy man, you know.
Yeah, it's normal now.
Scary.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I feel like the fact that all the architects of Brexit resigned as soon as it passed, that should tell you something. Why would anyone still be like, yeah, they had a plan? They didn't have a plan. Even if you liked their plan, they didn't have a plan. Like,
hey ho. Well, look,
we a dumb species, bro.
Yeah, I think we'll have to leave it on that. That it turns out that humanity is dumb. Maybe God existed or exists, but it's just a really shit creator. It's just like had some Play-Doh and went, oh, look at that. That looks fun.
Yeah.
Oh well. Let's have a few black holes. Smash them up. There you go. Yeah. Job done. Start again next year.
I'm mad at God for normalizing black holes.
Yeah. God damn.
That's what.
I can't sleep at night for black holes. But yeah, no, look, Jonathan, we have, we talking about a narrative and a vision and thinking about where we're going to go. We didn't have one, and we rambled, but I have really enjoyed talking to you, and perhaps we can do it again. Hopefully,
yeah, I would like that.
Hopefully some people have got a better understanding of who you are and what you believe, and I'm sure there's plenty more in your tank to offload to humanity.
Yes. So if people are interested, comic is called Blinky and Sal. It's on Patheos Nonreligious channel. It's also if you go to @BigInsaneHappy, there's Twitter, there's Instagram, and I have a couple books out.
I was just going to say, do you have any books out? So where should we look? On Amazon for your name, Jonathan Burrello?
Yeah.
Blinky and Sal.
They're all on they're all on Amazon, and I have two more that are coming out later this week. I have the one copy. This one is a fake copy because it has the bar across, but Todd Speed will be available in the next couple days or so. And this is just a collection of some of the cartoons from the site. I like books, and I think cartoons belong on paper. So that's my old fashion.
Good on you, mate. Good on you. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for taking the time. And I hope people do check out your stuff and keep working as hard as you do, doing the awesome stuff that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you. Thanks for having me on.